Welcome to 3 Minutes of History. I'm your future history teacher, Chris Oxenford, and let's get started.
October 2nd, 1919. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson has just returned to Washington from a grueling speaking tour in support of the Treaty of Versailles and his personal project, the League of Nations. Exactly what happened that morning is unclear. Some accounts claim that the president awoke with a feeling of numbness in his left hand before falling into unconsciousness. Others claim that he was found unconscious by his wife Edith Galt Wilson on his way to the bathroom. Either way, that morning Edith quietly telephoned the White House chief usher and asked him to send for Dr. Cary Grayson, Wilson's personal physician. Grayson arrived 10 minutes later and examined the unconscious president. He is reported to have said, "My God, the president is dead," upon seeing Wilson. Despite the doctor's hysterical reaction, Wilson was in fact not dead, although he might as well have been. He was paralyzed on his left side, unable to speak, blind in his left eye, and partially blind in his right. 1919 had been an exceedingly busy year for President Wilson. World War I had ended in a ceasefire on November 11, 1918, but the work of hammering out a permanent peace treaty had only begun on that day. Traveling to France personally, Wilson worked tirelessly to create a world that he envisioned, a world safe for democracy. But European leaders would have none of his idealism. They wanted to punish the defeated Central Powers, and especially Germany, for their role in starting World War I. The one provision of the ideal world that Wilson managed to get included in the Treaty of Versailles was the creation of the League of Nations, a worldwide body dedicated to enforcing peace. To achieve his goals, Wilson had driven himself to exhaustion. He cut out all exercise, relaxation, and entertainment sessions from his schedules and worked late into the night. When he had returned to the United States, Wilson's proposals for the Treaty of Versailles faced intense opposition. Republicans in Congress, led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, were disappointed that Wilson had not included them in the negotiations in France. Worse, in Lodge's view, was Wilson's inclusion of the League of Nations in the treaty, which Lodge believed would commit the United States to constantly intervening in European affairs and take away from Congress the ability to declare war. Faced with this Republican opposition, in September 1919, Wilson decided to take a whistle-stop tour of the United States to try and sell the people on his proposals. Once again, Wilson worked an intense and grueling schedule. On the morning of September 25th, Wilson became even more severely ill. He experienced severe nausea, twitching in his facial muscles, and weakness on the left side of his face. The next day, Joseph Tumulty, Wilson's personal secretary and political advisor, canceled the rest of Wilson's speaking tour, announcing that the president had, quote, a nervous reaction in his digestive organs. In the aftermath of Wilson's stroke, Edith Wilson, Joseph Tumulty, and Cary Grayson worked to cover up the extent of the president's disability. Edith Galt Wilson had only been married to the president for 4 years at the time of his stroke. She was the widow of Norman Galt, a prominent jeweler in Washington, D.C., who had died in 1908. When she was introduced to the president in 1915, just a year after the death of his first wife, Wilson fell head over heels in love with her, and they married on December 18, 1915. In her memoirs, Edith claimed that her husband remained in control of the government throughout the 17 months that followed his stroke. She claimed that she acted only as a caretaker, bringing him the most important business, helping him process the information and make a decision, and then communicate that decision to others. When asked how she decided what was important enough for Woodrow, Edith claimed, "I just did," claiming that she knew her husband well enough to make that decision. Memos that had been written to the president were returned with notes in Edith's handwriting. She met with and hired a new Treasury Secretary, and notes and instructions to the State Department were regularly signed with Edith's name rather than Wilson's, suggesting that she was acting as more than just a mere steward. While Edith handled the president's business, Dr. Grayson worked to keep the severity of Wilson's illness out of the press. Both Edith and Grayson kept the president largely out of the public's view. On December 5, 1919, Secretary of State Lansing was forced to admit to Congress that he had not seen the president since October. Understandably concerned, Congress dispatched Senators Albert Fall and Gilbert Hitchcock to examine the president for themselves. When they met Wilson, his left side was partially covered, but he was able to talk and communicate with them. A popular story of this meeting says that Senator Fall, a political opponent of Wilson, told the president that he was praying for him, and Wilson replied, "Which way, Senator?" Although neither Grayson nor Edith recorded this particular exchange. Over the remainder of the president's term, he slowly recovered, but many of his policies floundered without his leadership. The Treaty of Versailles, which Wilson had campaigned so hard to ratify, was never passed by the United States Senate. It was not until the Harding administration that the United States formally ended its involvement in World War I. After completing his term, President Wilson and Edith retired to a small house in Washington, D.C. Wilson had considered running for a third term, but was talked out of it by the Democratic Party and by his wife. He would die just 3 years after leaving office. Edith Galt Wilson, on the other hand, was president for both Franklin Delano Roosevelt's declaration of war on Japan on December 8, 1941, and for John F. Kennedy's inauguration in 1961. She died in 1961, one day before the dedication of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, named for her husband, in Washington, D.C.
This has been 3 Minutes of History. I'm Chris Oxenford. Thank you for joining me.